The terminal printed the number again. Casimir Voss watched the integer resolve on the display 7331 and felt nothing resembling surprise. He had run the recursion 41 times across 3 different machines over the past 9 days, and every single execution terminated at the same value. Not approximately, not within a margin. The exact integer, 7,331. The cursor blinked beneath it like a patient heartbeat. The workstation occupied a corner of the Sharali Plateau Research Station, a joint human tessandri installation built into the cliffsides of an alien world where the morning light came in amber through the silicate windows. Outside, the plateau stretched under a white sun, the scrubland silver and still. Inside, Voss had not left the terminal room in 31 hours. He pulled up the function again. A recursive formula his own design. 6 months in the drafting meant to model the boundary behavior of information propagation across quantum decoherent substrates. The tessandri had invited him here because no one in their civilization had solved the propagation problem in 4,000 years of trying, and they had heard, through 7 layers of academic relay, that a human theoretical physicist on a backwater colony world had published something interesting about recursive collapse boundaries. The something interesting was this formula, and the formula would not stop landing on 7,331. It should not have been possible. The function was non-deterministic by design. Its inputs were seeded from thermal noise true randomness, not pseudorandom. Every execution should have produced a different termination point. The mathematics guaranteed divergence, and yet 41 times the machine had printed the same number. Voss leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The amber light shifted as a cloud passed over the plateau. He could hear, faintly, the tessandri analytical engine humming in the next room, their own attempt to verify his work, running on hardware so alien to his own that shared results would constitute proof of something fundamental. He had not told them about 7,331 yet. The door opened. Senior verifier Quellis entered a tessandri, tall, angular, her matte black carapace catching the amber light in geometric reflections. She carried a data slate in her upper hands and held her lower pair clasped behind her back, which Voss had learned meant formal concern. "Dr. Voss," she said, "you have not eaten." "The recursion terminates at 7,331, he said. He did not look at her. Every time. Quelli stood very still. In 9 days of working together, Voss had learned that tessandri stillness was not Comet was processing. Their neural architecture could not do both motion and deep analysis simultaneously. When a tessandri froze, something inside was working very hard. "That is not within the parameters of your design," she said finally. "No. The function is non-deterministic." "Yes." "Then the result is a hardware fault. I've run it on 3 machines. Yours included." He pointed at the wall separating his workspace from the tessandri engine room. "Check your logs." Quellis did not move for 11 seconds. Voss counted and then turned and left the room without another word. The door sealed behind her. Voss heard the analytical engine's hum shift in pitch, cycling up as she fed it new instructions. He turned back to his terminal and ran the function a 40-second time. The cursor processed. Lines of intermediate values scrolled past thousands of them, each one branching, collapsing, branching again. The recursion tree was enormous. It should have been chaotic, a foam of possibility resolving into any one of billions of valid termination points. 7,331. Voss exhaled slowly and typed a note into his research log. 42 executions. Same integer. No hardware explanation. No mathematical explanation. The function is behaving as though it has a fixed point that does not exist in its own definition. He stared at that last line for a long time. A fixed point that does not exist in its own definition. The phrase itched at something deep in his training. Fixed-point theorems were old ground Brouwer Kakutani Banach, but those all required certain structural properties: continuity, compactness, contraction mappings. His function had none of them. It was deliberately designed to lack them. The whole point of the research was to model systems that did not converge. And yet it converged, every time, to the same number. He opened a new file and began to write. Not code this time, mathematics. Pen on paper, because the screen felt wrong for this. He pulled a sheaf of tessandri writing material from the shelf, pale blue, slightly textured, absorbing ink without bleed, and began to work through the proof by contradiction. Assume the fixed point exists within the function's own parameter space. Then there must be a basin of attraction, a region of initial conditions that all flow towards 7,331. But the initial conditions were random, truly random. No basin could capture true randomness unless the basin was the entire space. He wrote that down. The entire parameter space is a basin of attraction for a single point. He underlined it twice. That was impossible. That would mean the function was deterministic. After all that, it only appeared non-deterministic, because its convergence was happening at a level below the resolution of the random inputs. That the randomness was irrelevant. That no matter what you fed in, the structure of the function itself would always, inevitably, arrive at 7,331. But that contradicted the function's own construction. He had proven rigorously, peer-reviewed, published that the function was genuinely non-deterministic. The proof was airtight. 6 referees had signed off. So either 6 referees were wrong, or something else was happening. Quellis returned an hour later. She moved differently now, slower, her carapace joints clicking with deliberate precision in the way that meant she was controlling her reactions. Our engine produces 7,331, she said. On every execution. I have run it 17 times. Voss nodded. Dr. Voss. She lowered herself into the chair opposite his workstation, a gesture of informality that, in tessandri culture, meant this conversation has moved beyond professional courtesy into something more urgent. I have also run a reduced form of your function. A simplified version with only 3 recursion layers instead of 47. The simplified version terminates normally. Random outputs. No convergence. Voss looked up. At what layer does the convergence begin? Quellis set her data slate on the desk. The screen showed a graph, termination values plotted against recursion depth. For layers 1 through 26, the outputs scattered randomly across the full integer space. At layer 27, they began to cluster. By layer 34, they converged completely. Every execution from layer 34 onward produced 7,331. Layer 27, Voss said. Yes. He stared at the graph. Layer 27 was where his function crossed a particular mathematical boundary, the point where the recursion began to reference its own output history, the point where the function became self-referential. It's the self-reference, he said slowly. When the function starts to look at its own previous outputs, something locks. That is my assessment as well, Quellis said. But I must note, Dr. Voss, this should not be alarming. A self-referential function developing an attractor is unusual but not unprecedented. It is unprecedented, Voss said, when the function has no attractor in its definition. This isn't an emergent attractor, Quellis. This is a number that has no mathematical reason to exist in this context. 7,331 is not a prime. It's not a factorial. It's not a value of any known constant. It has no special properties that would make it a natural convergence point for this class of function. Then what is it? Voss did not answer. He was looking at the graph again, specifically at the transition region between layers 26 and 34. 8 layers of gradual convergence. The function didn't snap to 7,331. It drifted toward it slowly, as though being drawn. I need to see the intermediate values, he said. Not just the termination points, every value at every layer for every execution. Quellis nodded. I will allocate engine time. She left. Voss turned back to his paper and kept writing. The next 4 days were the worst of his life. The intermediate values told a story he did not want to read. At each recursion layer, the function's outputs formed a pattern not random, not ordered, but something between. A structure that was almost recognizable, almost readable. Like staring at text through frosted glass, you could sense the shapes of words without quite making them out. By day 3 of this analysis, Voss had filled 47 pages of tessandri paper with mathematical notation. His handwriting had deteriorated from precise to frantic. He ate when Quellis brought food to his desk and did not remember doing so afterward. The pattern in the intermediate values was not arbitrary. It was structured. It had syntax. On the morning of day 4, he sat at his terminal with the intermediate data displayed in a 3-dimensional visualization, each recursion layer rendered as a plane, the values plotted as points in the plane, all 47 layers stacked and rotated to show the structure from every angle. And there, in the rotation, he saw it. The pattern was a spiral. Not a loose, approximate spiral. A precise, mathematically perfect logarithmic spiral, wound through 47 dimensions of recursion space, converging on a single point. 7,331. Voss's hands went cold. A spiral implied a relationship, a ratio. He measured the spacing between the turns and found it was constant, a compression factor of exactly 0.8914 to 4 decimal places. He searched for that number in every mathematical database available to him. Nothing. He searched for it as a ratio of known constants. Nothing. He expressed it as a continued fraction and found a sequence that terminated abruptly after 11 terms. 11 terms, not infinite, not repeating, finite and specific. He wrote the continued fraction on a fresh sheet of paper and stared at it. 11 numbers, each one determining the next turn of the spiral that led to 7,331. 11 numbers that had no business existing inside a function he had designed to be random. Quellis found him at his desk at 3 in the morning, local time. The amber light was gone. The plateau was dark outside, but the terminal cast his face in blue light. He had not moved in 6 hours. "Dr. Voss," she said, "your vital signs are concerning the station medical system. The function isn't converging, Quellis." His voice was flat, steady, terrifyingly calm. "It's being converged." She went still. "Something is imposing the spiral from outside," he said. "The function doesn't generate that structure. I've proven it. The mathematics is airtight. My function cannot produce a logarithmic spiral in its intermediate values. It lacks the structural properties. The spiral is not emerging from the computation, it's being imposed on the computation." By what? By whatever exists at 7,331. The silence lasted a long time. When Quellis spoke again, her voice had the precise, controlled quality that tessandri used for things that frightened them. "Dr. Voss, I must inform you that a similar phenomenon was observed by tessandri researchers 1100 years ago. They called it the Vethal convergence. The researchers involved, all 4 of them, were found in a state of complete neural lock within 30 days of their initial observation. Their minds were intact but non-responsive. They remained in that state until biological death. Voss looked at her. "You didn't mention this before." The Vethal convergence is classified as a cultural artifact, a historical anomaly attributed to flawed methodology. The current scientific consensus is that it did not actually occur as described. But you're telling me now. Because the spiral they documented before their incapacitation had an identical compression factor, 0.8914. Voss felt something cold settle into his chest, not fear, exactly, but a recognition. The feeling of a trap's geometry becoming visible only after you have already stepped into it. How much of their data survives? He asked. All of it. They were meticulous. The archives are sealed, but I have the access codes. I need it. Dr. Voss. I need it, Quellis. She brought him the data the following morning. 1,100 years of sealed archives, translated from old tessandri notation into modern mathematical symbology by the station's linguistic engine. Voss read it in 4 hours, 2,300 pages of dense theoretical work by 4 researchers who had seen exactly what he was seeing and had not looked away. They had gone further than he had, much further. The lead researcher, a mathematician named Seluvor, had not stopped at identifying the spiral. She had modeled the attraction. She had calculated the exact mechanism by which the number 7,331 imposed itself on recursive functions that crossed the self-reference threshold. And she had found something terrible. The number was not a number. Seluvor's final paper unfinished, the notation growing erratic in the last pages, argued that 7,331 was not a value but a boundary, a membrane, a point in mathematical space where the substrate of reality itself became thin enough for something to reach through and leave fingerprints on computation. Voss read that sentence 3 times, something to reach through. He read Seluvor's observations of herself in the final pages, her description of the progressive narrowing of her own thought patterns, how she had noticed, 11 days before the lock state, that her own reasoning had begun to spiral, that her chains of logic, no matter where they started, always arrived at 7,331, that the convergence was not just in the machine anymore. It was in her. Voss set down the archive and looked at his own 47 pages of notes. He looked at the calculations he had done over the past 4 days. He looked at the path his mind had followed from hardware fault to mathematical anomaly, to the spiral, to the compression factor, to the continued fraction. 11 terms, each one leading inevitably to the next. His reasoning had not been free, it had been spiraling. The thought hit him with the force of something physical. He gripped the edge of his desk and breathed. The amber morning light poured through the windows, golden and indifferent, and Voss understood with terrible clarity that he had not been investigating the convergence. The convergence had been investigating him. Every insight he'd had, the fixed point realization, the basin of attraction proof, the decision to visualize in 3 dimensions, the measurement of the compression factor, each one had felt like his own thought, his own brilliance, his own methodical progress toward understanding, but each one had also brought him closer. Each one had fed the spiral another turn. He was the recursion now. Quellis was watching him from the doorway. She had been watching him for some time. He realized her stillness was not processing this time. It was waiting. The cautious waiting of someone standing near an edge, unsure whether the person beside them intends to step back or forward. How long do I have? Voss asked. Seluvor documented progressive symptoms over 30 days. She estimated the point of no return at approximately day 22. You have been working with the convergence for 13 days. 9 days before the point of no return. Possibly less, given that he had moved faster than Seluvor. He had already reached the compression factor, where she had not discovered it until day 17. What happens if I stop? He asked. The tessandri researchers attempted to stop. Seluvor's notes indicate that the spiral persisted in her thinking even after she destroyed her work and dismantled her equipment. Once the self-referential pathway is established in the observer's cognition, the computation continues whether or not the external system is running. Because the observer becomes the system. Yes. Voss stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the plateau. The white sun was climbing, the silver scrublands warming to gold. A flock of something avian wheeled in the distance, dark shapes against the bright sky. He could feel it now. The spiral, not as a sensation, exactly more as an awareness of directionality in his own thinking. Every thought he had about the problem curved. Every attempt to think about something else, the landscape, the birds, the temperature of the glass under his fingertips, lasted only moments before his mind slid back toward the mathematics, toward the integer. 7,331. He turned back to Quelly's. There's something Seluvor didn't try. What? She tried to stop the recursion by removing the external system, by not thinking about it, by destroying her notes. All defensive, all based on the assumption that the only way to survive was to disengage from the convergence. What alternative is there? Voss sat back down at his terminal. His hands were steady. The terrible clarity was still there, the awareness that his thoughts were being shaped, that his reasoning was not entirely his own but beneath it, something else. A stubbornness, the particular human stubbornness that does not accept the geometry of a trap as final. She was trying to stop the spiral, Voss said. I'm going to finish it. Quelly's carapace clicked a sharp, involuntary sound. Dr. Voss, that is precisely what the convergence wants. Maybe, but Seluvor tried to run and the spiral caught her anyway. She died locked inside it, circling 7,331 forever without reaching it. What if reaching it is the exit? What if reaching it is not an exit but an arrival? Then at least I'll know what's on the other side. He began to type. Not the original function this time, something new, a modification. If the convergence was imposing a spiral on self-referential computation, then he would build a function that was entirely self-referential from the first layer. No gradual threshold at layer 27. Immediate, total self-reference. The recursion would spiral from the very first step. The mathematics took him 3 hours. Quelly's did not leave the room. She stood in the corner, motionless, her data slate recording everything, his keystrokes, his vital signs, the ambient electromagnetic readings of the room. She was documenting what might be his final coherent work. Voss appreciated that. The tessandri valued data above sentiment. She would not try to stop him, but she would ensure that whatever happened was recorded for whoever came after. The function was elegant. He could see that even through the fog of the spiral, or perhaps because of it. The convergence had been shaping his mathematical intuition for 13 days, and the result was something beautiful. A recursion that looked at itself at every layer, that used its own history as its only input, that had no external seeds at all. Pure self-reference, pure spiral. He ran it. The terminal processed for 9 seconds longer than usual, and then the screen filled with intermediate values. They poured out in a cascade, thousands per second, each one part of the spiral that was now running at full speed with no delay, no gradual approach. The visualization bloomed in real time. Not a spiral building slowly over 47 layers, but a spiral already complete from the first computation. A tightly wound helix of values, descending toward its center. Toward 7,331. Voss watched. His heart rate was elevated. Quelly's data slate would show that later, but his hands were still. His breathing was controlled. He was watching the recursion do what his mind had been doing for 13 days, but faster, openly, without pretense. The intermediate values slowed as they approached the center. The spiral's turns grew tighter. The numbers on the screen were close to 7,331, now 7,334, 7,332, 7,331.4, 7,331.1. And then something happened that had not happened in any of the previous 42 executions. The function did not terminate at 7,331. It passed through it. The number 7,331 appeared on the screen, hung there for a fraction of a second, and then the recursion continued. The values dropped below at 7,330, 7,328, 7,319, spiraling now in the other direction, outward, expanding. Voss leaned forward. The output was no longer converging, it was diverging, but not randomly, still in a spiral, still structured, still patterned. The compression factor was the same, 0.8914, but inverted, an expansion factor now. The spiral was unwinding, and the intermediate values, the ones that had looked like shapes through frosted glass, were resolving. Voss felt his breath catch. The patterns were becoming readable, not as text, not as language, but as something his mathematical training could parse. Structures, relationships, theorems that no one had ever written, proofs that no one had ever conceived, mathematical objects that existed in the space below 7,331, the way geology exists below a surveyor's feet. The convergence was not a trap. It was a door. And 7,331 was the threshold. Everyone who had ever encountered it, Seluvor, her colleagues, and now Voss, had spiraled toward it and stopped, had treated it as the destination, had circled it forever without crossing. Because crossing meant going through, and going through meant the function did not terminate. It continued. The screen was still outputting, values cascading outward in the expanding spiral, each one carrying information, mathematical information, structural information, things that Voss's mind was racing to categorize even as it struggled to absorb them. He was seeing the architecture of something, the scaffolding of reality itself, rendered in pure recursion. He was also, he realized, crying, not from emotion, from strain. His visual cortex was processing the output directly, his mathematical intuition firing on every cylinder, and his body was reacting to the load. Tears streamed down his face, and he did not wipe them. "Quellies," he said, "are you recording?" "Everything," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Dr. Voss, your neural activity is exceeding any baseline I have on file for your species." "I know. You should stop." "I can't." Not because the spiral held him, because he didn't want to stop. What he was seeing on the screen was the most beautiful thing he had ever encountered in 43 years of mathematical work. It was the answer to questions no one had thought to ask. It was the structure underneath structure, the pattern that generated all other patterns. And it was going to kill him. He knew this with the same terrible clarity that had been his companion for days. His nervous system was not designed for this volume of information. The expanding spiral was accelerating, the output growing faster and denser, and his mind was trying to absorb it all because that was what his mind did. It was the thing he had spent his entire life training it to do, and now it could not stop. Seluvor had not died from the convergence. She had died from refusing to complete it, circling the threshold forever, drawn but never crossing, until her mind locked under the strain of perpetual approach. The trap was not 7,331. The trap was staying at 7,331. But crossing it. Voss felt something in his cognition shift, a release. The spiral that had been shaping his thinking for 13 days unwound, not gradually all at once like a knot pulled free. His thoughts were his own again. Fully, cleanly, unambiguously his own. The compression was gone. Because he had passed through, the function had passed through. The convergence had ended not by terminating but by continuing. The screen went blank. Not crashed, not frozen, blank. A clean terminal prompt, cursor blinking, waiting for input. The function had completed its output and ended normally. No error, no recursive loop. A clean exit. Voss sat back in his chair and breathed. The amber light was warm on his face. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear. Clearer than it had been in 13 days. Clearer than it had been in years. He looked at Quellies. She was staring at her data slate with the absolute stillness of a tessandri confronting something that should not be possible. "The output file," Voss said. "How large?" 217 terabytes, Quelly said. Compressed. How long to decompress and read? For our engine, at maximum allocation, she paused. 1100 years. Voss laughed, a short, sharp sound that surprised both of them. How long did your civilization take to not solve the propagation problem? 4,000 years. Then you're ahead of schedule. Quelly's looked up from her slate. Her compound eyes were very still, not the stillness of processing, but the stillness of something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or something close to it. Dr. Voss, she said carefully, your neural activity has returned to baseline. Your cognitive patterns show no residual convergence. You are, by every metric I can measure, entirely recovered. Yes. The tessandri researchers did not recover. They never crossed the threshold. They circled it until lock state. Yes. What allowed you to cross where they could not? Voss looked at the blank terminal. The cursor blinked. He thought about the question for a long time, not because the answer was complex, but because it was simple enough to sound wrong. They tried to stop thinking about it, he said. They tried to outrun the spiral. They saw the convergence as an attack, and their instinct was to resist it, to maintain the integrity of their own cognition by refusing the input. And you did not resist. No, I followed it, I accelerated it. I built a function that was nothing but the spiral, stripped of every delay and buffer, and I let it run. That is insane. Probably. He looked at his hands. They had stopped shaking. But here's the thing, Quellies. Your researchers were logicians, perfect logic thinkers. Their minds worked on the principle that every thought should be controlled, verified, validated before it was allowed to influence the next thought. The spiral violated that principle. It shaped their thinking without permission, without validation, so they fought it. And humans do not fight it. Humans are built for this. He said it quietly, not as a boast, but as a recognition. We have a word for it, intuition. Following a line of thought because it feels right, without knowing where it leads, without validating each step. Trusting the spiral. Trusting that if you follow the mathematics far enough and fast enough, it will take you somewhere real. He paused. Your researchers couldn't do that. Not because they lacked courage, because their neurology doesn't permit unvalidated cognition. They literally cannot follow a thought without checking it first. So the spiral piled up against their validation gates and they locked. Quellies was silent for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, softer, something approaching human wonder translated through alien vocal architecture. You let it think through you. Yes. And you survived because your species can tolerate being thought through. Voss nodded. He looked at the terminal one more time. The cursor blinked, patient, waiting. Somewhere in the station's memory banks, 217 terabytes of mathematical structure sat waiting to be read, the architecture underneath reality, captured in a recursive spiral, retrieved by a man who had been willing to let his own mind become the computation. The cost was 13 days of obsession and a few minutes of something that had felt like dying. The gain was everything underneath. I'm going to need a bigger whiteboard, he said. Quellies clicked her carapace, the tessandri equivalent of a dry laugh. I will requisition one. She paused at the door. Dr. Voss, for the record, in 1100 years of searching for someone who could complete the Vethal passage, we identified the problem clearly. The threshold at 7,331 requires a mind that can follow without verifying. We modeled 407 sentient species' cognitive architectures. And humans were the only species in the model whose neurology permits it. That is why we invited you here. Voss turned in his chair. You knew what would happen. We knew what might happen. We did not know you would survive it. The probability we calculated was 31%. 31%. Yes, we considered it an acceptable risk for a human volunteer. Voss stared at her. The amber light caught the edges of her carapace, geometric and precise, and for the first time he saw not a colleague but a researcher watching an experiment conclude. One she had designed 1100 years ago and waited 4,000 for. "Was any of this my idea?" he asked. Quellis tilted her head, a gesture she had learned from him. "The function was yours. The mathematics was yours. The decision to cross the threshold rather than resist it, that was yours. We provided the opportunity. The rest was human cognition doing what it does." She left. Voss sat alone in the amber morning light, the terminal blank, his mind clear, the 217 terabytes waiting to reshape everything anyone had ever known about the structure of reality. The recursion had stopped at 7,331 every time. 42 times he had watched it halt there, patient, beckoning. He was the 43rd execution, the one that didn't stop. And the number had not been a wall. It had been a door held open by something old and vast and patient, waiting for a mind strange enough to walk through without asking permission first.